Hello, and welcome to podcast number 20 of the Down the Spirituality and Science Rabbit Hole podcast. This one is another dialogue that's part of the Philosophical Questions series, which are dialogues between myself and Donald Weiss. The title of this one is simply God Questions.
Yeah, hi, Jeff. It's the 24th of September, 2024. We have an ongoing conversation, the broad contours of which are, is it intellectually responsible in this day and age still to believe in God? Let's put that in quotation marks because I have a hunch that much will turn on what we mean by God, which leads us into all sorts of bypaths and pathways. So I'm going to let Jeff take the lead today. He's expressed a desire to give us a little presentation, which is probably the best way for us to start. So I'm Don Weiss, and I'm introducing Jeff Taylor. Jeff, take it away.
Thank you, Don. Well, I have to admit, I spent a great deal of time thinking about how we wanted to approach this. Essentially, we're looking at three main questions and discussing them. What does it mean to say God exists? What are right and wrong ways to think about God? And what does God do or not do? And in thinking about this, I found that I didn't really want to get involved in any one religion's perspective. I didn't want it to be a Christian perspective or a Jewish perspective. I looked at it that if we're going to talk about God, we almost need to talk about him from a world religion standpoint. So that's kind of where I'm taking this, and we'll see where that goes. And in doing that, I'm including science into this, as if it were a religion. What does science, or what might science tell us about God? I'm keeping it very general and very easy to understand. I will present another podcast specifically dealing with quantum field theory. Again, no math or anything, but it's really something that I need about 30 or 45 minutes to get across. We will just be dealing with some generalities here and taking them as a given. So one example of the remarkable similarity between the findings of science and the finding of religion is that both reveal that the material realm is not what it seems. Many religious traditions hold that matter is an illusion. Especially this is true of Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism, and which have a concept of Maya, which is the world is an illusion. Even in the Americas, I mentioned Buddhism, Hinduism, but even the native religions of North, Central, and South America have this concept of the Great Spirit. And I felt that that also needs to be included because it covers a fair amount of territory and number of people.
Are you looking for what's common to all of those things?
Exactly. What I have found, much to my amazement over the past 20 years or so, is that when you get down to the basic fundamentals, and throw away what all I would call window dressing, the core ideas of almost all religions are fundamentally the same. And one of the premises here is that the Eastern religions, including the Native American religions, have always taught that the mind is part of a universal energy field that can be interacted through the human mind. The universe we experience with our senses is an illusion. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It means that what we think we see is not the true fundamental nature of reality. And this is where I'll bring in findings of modern day science. I actually concur that matter is nothing like what it seems to be. Most of reality is hidden from our senses. Our senses tend to tell us one thing, but the nature of quantum field theory tells us that we're not really seeing that. So when we consider both scientific and religious spiritual ideas about God, For science, the most support for the spiritual world is found in what I just said, quantum field theory. This is considered the most successful and accurate theory in physics that also says something about the nature of reality. So, why is quantum field theory important? Because when we get right down to it, the world is composed of fields, not matter. Matter is an epiphenomenon, so to speak, of fields. Fields are distributed everywhere in the universe. The gravitational field goes through the whole universe. And from recent advances in physics, they found that with entanglement, there's instantaneous communication between all of these fields. So things like, let me get my thoughts straight here. If we look at altered states of human consciousness, such as near-death experiences, ESP, out-of-body experiences, meditation, prayer, and other psychic things, these experiences are being scientifically investigated as a possible human minefield. Not minefield as in little explosives devices, but the mind is a field that interacts now with all of the other types of fields that make up human reality. And this is a very nicely universal way of looking at things. And it also can give us some ideas if we look at what all of these religions are saying at their core and what science is saying at their core. We find that there's not a whole lot of difference. As a matter of fact, a little story, Albert Einstein was asked by his rabbi, did he believe in God? And when Einstein answered, he said he believed in the God of Spinoza. Now, Spinoza was a philosopher that lived about when, Don?
Late 1600s, second half of the 17th century.
But what made Spinoza so unique is he was what was called a pantheist. He believed that the universe was God, that God was physically present throughout the whole universe and was a spiritual part of the whole universe. This is very consistent with Native American and indigenous religions of the American Indians and the indigenous American people. They just simply call it the Great Spirit, but it's everywhere. It's in every plant, it's in every animal, it pervades the universe. So another way of thinking about pantheism is that God permeates and is a fundamental part of the universe and even humanity. In the Gospel of John, Jesus makes the statement that a lot of people confuse. He says, I and the Father are one. He wasn't indicating he was God. He was indicating that there was a part of God in him that made up who he was. And if you read a little bit further on, he actually says, anyone who listens to my teachings can reach the same level of spirituality that I had. So it opens up a number of things, I think, if we look at it from this perspective. Don, you have any thoughts on it?
Yeah, well, I have. I think it's a great beginning for a conversation. I mean, when you engage in a process of finding out what's common to a whole lot of diverse traditions, you're going to open yourself up to questions of a certain kind, like granted all of that, aren't there some important differences that you're kind of sliding over when you do that? In particular, I can go a long way with you in your worldview. In fact, based upon my previous conversations with you, I know that we agree about a whole lot of stuff, and that the universe itself is a living, intelligent entity, that things going on inside it on all levels manifest, well, let us say, characteristics that ordinary materialism does not take seriously. I agree with you all about all of that, to such an extent that I'm willing to say with Spinoza that one of the names that we could give to nature itself, to the world itself, is God. And that's what leads us to call Spinoza a pantheist. And I can go along with all of that, but I still have a question. My question is, but doesn't that mean that there is something we do have to give up, namely that old-fashioned idea, which is what most people mean by God, of a God outside the universe who can intervene from outside the universe in worldly affairs. He has a causal effect on things. He is responsive to our needs. He hears our prayers and answers them. He works the world so that our value system is advanced. I'm not saying we should believe that, but it seems to me, the ordinary understanding of God. When we say God exists, we don't merely mean that the universe itself should be viewed as in divine, intelligent terms, where the universe is the divine thing. No, we mean that there's a force outside the universe that can plunge his hand into this universe, altering events as necessary or desired. So it seems to me that, though I can go a long way with you on in your beliefs, it seems to me we do have to admit that we're giving up something when we give up old-fashioned theism. Theism being the idea that there is this external interventionist God. Isn't it true that the other side of your argument would have to be that we do have to give up that, well, let's now call it more naive view of what divinity is all about and start paying attention to the universe itself as the divine thing?
Well, let me peel off one part of that to make it a little bit more manageable. Science can't say anything about what's outside the universe. And for that matter, I don't think religion can either. Whether God resides in the universe or outside the universe is a question that I don't think we'll ever have any data to answer that.
I don't mean place of residence. I want to lay the stress on intelligent being who intervenes in, who interrupts the ordinary processes of nature and so forth. For example, the belief in miracle here becomes crucial. I don't mean that there aren't dazzling things that happen in the world, but I mean that it's the things of the world, the creatures of the world that can do those dazzling things. The ordinary theist, however, believes that miracles are an external intelligent force who is able to plunge into the universe, altering the course of events within it. It's that I suggest doesn't fit well into a pantheistic framework.
Well, I agree with what you're saying there, and it raises a very good question that we go back to: what are the right and wrong ways to think about God? Now, you made the specific term about, and I like the way you phrased it, God plunges his hand down into the universe and manipulates things. And you bring to mind
the Hebrew writers who influenced me in my thinking about the Bible. That's the way. It's in somewhat graphic terms that they think of God's activity in the world when they do think of it that way. So yes, I do like that kind of phrase to bring it to light.
And you also mentioned miracles. And in looking at this over about 20 years, I've come to realize that when you start talking miracles, everybody has to agree on a definition of what a miracle is. Is a miracle a violation or a usurpation of natural law? Is it something we just can't explain? Is it something that's just unusual, that's like, wow, I didn't expect that? So the definition of miracle will put a great deal of emphasis on how you think about it. But in the way you describe, this comes under the question of what are right and wrong ways to think about God. And I'll take this from a philosophical point of view. What does it mean to think about God one way? And I'm thinking about people, well, I just watched the Washington Commanders and the Cincinnati Bengals last night. Numerous people, when they scored a touchdown, pointed to heaven and looked like they were mouthing a prayer and giving thanks. Now, does that mean that they actually think that God plunged his hand down and intervened in the universe so that they could score a touchdown? It tends to get a little bit on the incredulous side in terms of what is God paying attention to. More importantly, I've talked to people that are convinced that God has intervened in their life, but I've noticed it's always about something good. In other words, I was in a robbery and the man had a gun and he didn't shoot me. And I gave thanks to God because God intervened and caused the man not to shoot me. Well, what about all the robberies where someone did shoot somebody and killed them? What does that say to the people that bad things happen to? It seems that in this view of God, God does nothing wrong. He's only responsible for good things that happen in our life. And if that's so, you wind up again with the problem of evil. Where did the evil come from? So that's what I mean when you're talking about right and wrong ways, because I think it's problematic to think that God reaches down and is literally controlling the strings of everything that happens to everybody, but he's only responsible for the good things that happen.
Mhm. I still want to get back to the question of theism versus pantheism. I mean, it seems that, to be honest, we do have to give up the idea. Well, let me refocus by bringing up an example from last week. Okay, we were discussing prayer, and I asked if you don't we have to give up the idea of a God who directly answers our prayers? It's a big thing to give up, it would seem. There are a lot of people out there who actually do seem to believe in the efficacy of prayer. I see them all over Facebook. At least they appear to believe that. They say that they believe that. They call themselves prayer warriors. I'll go a step further and say it seems to me a whole big part of what we call evangelical Christianity today, that this idea of prayer and the efficacy of prayer weighs very heavily with these people. They seem to believe in it quite fervently. And when I asked you, don't you have to give up the idea when you view things pantheistically? So there is no God outside who, other than the universe itself, which is a divine place to be sure, but the prayer answerer who intervenes on our behalf doesn't seem to be there any longer. And you responded that prayer would have a certain kind of efficacy.
Well, yeah, let me separate it from pantheism, because it really doesn't matter whether God's outside the universe or inside the universe. The question is, does God intervene in the universe, no matter where he's at? So right. I'll just separate it from pantheism in that respect. But this is a very difficult question, because when I was a youth leader at my church with high school age kids, one of the questions that always got asked was, my mother had cancer and I prayed every day for her to be cured and she died. Now you're in a really tough situation of what in the world do you say to that young girl? God answers prayers, but he didn't answer your prayers. Your prayers weren't as important as someone else's prayers.
But it's here. Let me interrupt. It's here that I think that you could either be courageous or not, as a certain kind of pantheist that I am too. And yeah, it does mean that. In other words, I in good taste, I don't want to get into a conversation much about it at all when I'm talking to a mourning person, a grieving person. I don't want to say anything impolite. But if there came a proper place for an intellectual discussion of the matter, I would say, yeah, we do have to give up the idea that when a loved one is suffering from cancer, that there is a God there who will answer our prayers. Yeah, I do think we have to give that up. We can do other things. We can believe in certain kinds of spiritual measures, meditation techniques and whatnot, trying to get on good wavelengths with each other, and all sorts of interesting things that the creatures of the world can do in order to try to concentrate their psychic energies. Yeah, I believe that kind of stuff is possible.
Well, here's where I think.
But I do think you have to give up the idea that there is a God who answers our prayers when it comes to such things as curing cancer, right? Yeah.
Well, I think rather than give it up, we need to modify it, maybe even heavily. And the scientific studies that have been done in this can actually help us. There's a group, actually there's several groups that have been studying the efficacy of prayer. Now, how do you do this? This, from the scientific point of view, there are a huge number of variables in a human being. I'm a type 2 diabetic. Every now and then I wear a monitor that monitors my glucose. And this is so you can tell what eating certain things and certain lifestyles do to your blood sugar. And as a scientist, it's almost useless because I eat the same thing 2 different days and not the same thing happens. And there are so many variables that enter into my blood sugar, time of day, and you do one thing one day and your blood sugar goes up. You do one thing exactly the same the next day. So you run into too many variables that you can't control, which is the bane of any scientific experiment. So the people that did this research used plants. Plants are much simpler organisms to get a hold of. And they didn't go into specifics like disease, trying to cure a disease. They strictly focused on the well-being of the plants. And that could be assessed by measuring the height, the number of leaves, how fast they grew, how many leaves they had. There were a number of things that you could use as test points to get data to say this is happening to the plants. And they did it on hundreds and hundreds of plants with these experiments. And of course, it all gets thrown into statistics. And what they found is there was a very good, statistically significant number that said plants that were prayed for fundamentally did better than plants that were not prayed for. Now, these plants are all in the same greenhouse, sitting side by side with controls. This is well done science. And it's well done because they're trying to limit the variables and only measuring things. The question they're answering is, does prayer make plants healthier? And what they found was amazing because they did investigate things. Like, how many people were praying for the plants?
When I pressed you on that question last week, you admitted that you didn't want to include as part of your explanatory hypothesis the idea that there was any kind of God who intervened, but would rather start talking about the powers that human beings have when they're in certain kind of meditative states to alter things outside of themselves. I'm not saying that's true, by the way, nor am I endorsing that particular experiment you were talking about, but I'll leave open the possibility that all sorts of weird things and connections are possible, that people who love their plants, I know some people who love their plants, can actually, in a spiritual sense, actually affect the health of their plants favorably. I'll go along with all that kind of stuff, but it has nothing to me to do with prayer, essentially, in the sense of saying, of including in my narrative the idea that there's a God who answered my prayers, or asking me to believe that when I prayed for these plants, God, who otherwise would not have done anything about those poor things, heard my prayers, our prayers, I should say, and directed his attention to this matter that he would not have been paying attention to unless we had prayed. But he did.
Here's how you might.
He did.
You bring up.
That's all the stuff I can't believe any longer.
Well, let me just go through the 3 things they found that were unequivocally true. Mm-hmm. Distance made no difference in the efficacy of prayer. They could be on the other side of the United States, or they could be down the road. Distance did not seem to matter.
No, I'm not denying the marvel of the. You see, here's the thing. Don't hear me wrong. I'm not denying. Let's allow that marvelous things like this can happen from a great distance included. That it's statistically significant. Now, I don't know whether it is, but I'm going to grant for the sake of argument that it is. I'm going to say in any case, however, that we're going to attribute these results to what we did. not to a God outside, but to the fact that we got our psychic forces together or whatever it was and caused this thing to happen. That's a beginning of an explanation. Again, not necessarily so, but possible. But it's a this worldly explanation. It doesn't involve anything supernatural whatsoever. That's the point.
Well, let me just do the three things and then draw a conclusion from it. Distance did not matter. The number of people praying did matter. Also, the experience level of the people. Seasoned meditators that were used to meditating had much better results than people that never meditated. All three of these things point to the fact that what may be causing this, like you said, is not God, it's us doing it.
If we're not God, it's us.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly my point. And I'm willing to leave open the possibility that we have far more psychic powers than we ordinarily allow. I'm going to leave that as an open question anyway. But what's to be noticed here is that it doesn't involve bringing God into the picture at all. It focuses attention on what kinds of things are possible in this very strange. We already know the universe is very strange.
One way of thinking about this is God made the universe in a way that prayer would work. Conscious beings praying or meditating could affect reality in the world. Now, you can bring that in as saying God created the world with this mechanism in it. But if you look at most of the Eastern religions don't really say you sit around and wait for God to do something. If you want a miracle to happen, you need to make it happen yourself. And this would be fairly consistent with that idea. There's a mechanism in the world that involves the human mind, whether it's the overlap of the fields or whatever. There's a mechanism where the human mind can have an effect on things in the universe. Now, that does leave God out of it in terms of the day-to-day work, but it can still bring him in terms of he created a pantheistic universe where the mechanism is there. That also gets us away from the tricky question of why do some prayers get answered and some not get answered? It may very well depend on the person who's praying, how many people are praying. Certainly prayer is not consistent. It's like the placebo effect.
You make some interesting points. The fact that it was skilled meditators who did so well under those circumstances points in the direction of saying it's not prayer in the sense of supplicative prayer to God to intervene in my life. It's not that at all. It's meditation, which by the way, can be described without bringing anything having to do with God. It has to do with a certain kind of concentrated state of consciousness. I grant you all of that. And it's a difficult thing to do to get yourself into that deeply meditative state. But it doesn't have anything to do with divinity. It has to do with concentrated human psychic power. And that, of course, focuses on this universe. As far as God is concerned, then, we're back where we started, it seems to me, without any particular reason for bringing him in. I suppose one could say there's room still theoretically for a God in this picture, but the picture I get is a universe that operates according to what goes on inside of itself, with no reference to an outside being who might intervene, to whom we can pray, who does miraculously intervene in various ways on our behalf and so forth. No, it doesn't leave room for that, so that it seems to me we do have to say you can have a nice thing here. You can have a lot of the spiritual universe you're dreaming of and that religion does authentically deal with. You can have that part, but you're going to have to be satisfied to find it inside the world with us.
There is another caveat to this. The seasoned meditators all said it wasn't us really that did this. It's us through the force of God that was an intermediate. It was like the prayers went up They didn't go laterally. They kind of went up and then came back down, but it wasn't God that was actually intervening. It was them. But if they didn't believe in God, would they have been as effective? So there was a great quote here that I'm going to quote right now. Disease is not cured by pronouncing the name of the medicine, but by taking the medicine. Therefore, spiritual deliverance is not achieved by repeating the word God, but by directly experiencing God. The meditators who were the most effective were those people that claimed they had directly experienced God, and he was part of the mix of what they were doing. Now, that could have just been their perception, but it seems to have made them particularly effective at this.
Well, that's the narrative that they might prefer to tell themselves. The question is, what do we have a right to say? And so surely on the basis of an experiment like that, I can say this. Sure, I can understand how people want to read into it. God exists. I've seen people jump to conclusions like that from an evidence base like this. But no, the evidence base itself doesn't support that. It may point in the direction of the efficacy of certain kind of human psychic states, but again, an explanation that actually did attempt to explain things by bringing God in would be subject to the question, why do you need that hypothesis? What does that get you? How do we test that hypothesis against the idea that it was human powers that did it? Why should we make an exception to all our other cases where we look for worldly explanations of what happens inside the world?
Well, let me bring in another aspect of this, and I'm going to be quoting now Bernardo Kastrup. His idea is that there is a pervasive universal cosmic consciousness. He doesn't use the word God. Most philosophers are reluctant to use the word God for a good reason.
And rightly so, because it isn't God. It's an attempt to view the world in psychic terms, true, but it isn't the old-fashioned God out there who answers our prayer and intervenes, who is conscious of our needs and intervenes in our lives. It's not that idea any longer. That's what it's not. And because of that, Kastrup and others say, let's be honest and not call it God.
Right. And what he's saying is, he uses the whirlpool metaphor, where we're in a sea of this universal cosmic consciousness. And there are little whirlpools in this that have self-accentuated, and just the whirlpools are individual people or individual consciousness. And it's entirely possible that these whirlpools can split off information or parts of themselves, and it gets taken up by another whirlpool. In other words, prayer would be two whirlpools that somehow the information came out of the top of the whirlpool, went to another whirlpool, was sucked down in. But it gives you this idea of there's this universal cosmic consciousness that we are literally a part of. We're a whirlpool within that. And Kastrup's metaphor does explain an awful lot in terms of things, but you're absolutely right. It is not the old idea of God that is intervening in the world, pulling strings, doing this and doing that. And I think the reason why philosophers don't use that is the word God carries way too much baggage with it. There are too many preconceptions and things like that, where you mention a word like that, and everybody then interprets that with their own personal view.
But more to the point, why should we call cosmic consciousness or the like, if such a thing exists, why should we call cosmic consciousness God, when it is freighted with all those old meanings of the intelligent, compassionate being who loves me, but is omnipotent and omniscient and can intervene on my behalf, and will do so when it is right for him to do so.
So let me ask a question. Is belief in a personal God still worthy of being believed in?
Well, that's the question. You see, and it seems to me that any defense that you make of the of cosmic consciousness and a world that is inhabited by spirit, in the sense that the creatures within it on all different kinds of levels have such powers, it seems to me that this particular kind of conception, if this is what you're encouraging in us, then I think we do have to say that we're not talking about the personal God of religion at all any longer. And that is a tough. I do want to stress how tough a point. I don't want to just pass over it as if we could given a vindication for being religious and just go back to what you were doing. No, I think there's a big challenge here to the old-fashioned believer. It gets back to that question we discussed about the person whose mother died of cancer, and wondered what happened. Why did my mother die despite my prayers? That ultimately we do have to pass a point in our lives, and I guess I have to admit I will do so unto death. I'm getting on in years. And I just don't believe that prayer is going to be part of the story of my next.
Bring me back to a point that I left something out. The study with plants and prayer. What they found out is if you waited too late, if the plants were starting to die, nobody, no matter how many people prayed, the plants died. So there is a point in all this where the efficacy of what we're looking at fails to be effective because things die.
Yeah, and
people die, plants die, everything dies.
And nobody ever believes that all of our prayers are answered. We always have a reason. God knew better is the typical answer. He knew what was good for me. I thought I knew what was good for me, but he didn't answer that prayer because he knew it was good for me. Hard to understand how that could be mapped onto the question of the young woman whose mother has died of cancer. All those old questions that we look at in philosophy courses in college, the tough ones raised by Dostoevsky about the suffering inside the universe, and is there a God?
Well, let's go back. We've been looking at God as a cosmic spiritual being here. I want to invoke some Jesus sayings that I think you very much like. We're going to go back to the Lord's Prayer, which I know is a favorite topic of yours.
Yes.
The opening line of the Lord's Prayer is, "Our Father who art in heaven." Jesus routinely talks about God in very personal terms. Not just a father, our Father, not just a father figure. He's ours in the same intimate sense that consciousness and life are ours. It's a relatively, that seems to conflict a little bit with this idea of God's this non-interactive thing that we have no communication with. It just goes on. Jesus certainly saw God as a personal thing that could make a difference in your life if you looked at it the right way. And our Father who art in heaven, God's being is in heaven. It's incommensurable with the nature of it's down here with us. God is in his heaven. He's in a different place, yet he's intimately familiar with us. So Jesus puts him out there, but also brings him in at a level that's extremely intimate. And this is consistent with people that believe in a personal God. Again, science has done studies on twins that have the same biological makeup. Twins that believed in a personal God live longer than twins that did not and were more of an atheistic bent. Our belief in who God is could have a direct impact in the quality of our life.
Yeah, and I'll second that motion, but I'm not going to give it any kind of interpretation that you would give it. Yeah, I'll admit that people who believe in God sometimes are happier people. They are sometimes happier people, and they are, for that reason, in better shape sometimes than people, sometimes depressive people who don't have the consolations of religion, who, by the way, can get so disconsolate and depressed that it does have an effect on their life. It can even lead to suicide, of course. So, yeah, I don't know where arguments like that point, Jeff. The idea that people feel better, maybe even do better a little bit in life if they can believe in God. You know, I can go along with that, but that's not part of what I call intellectual honesty. That's what we remember our framework. Our framework was: is it intellectually responsible to believe such things any longer? And that's where I won't go along with it.
Well, let me read a quote from Aldous Huxley's book, The Perennial Philosophy, because what we've been talking about here is pretty much the perennial philosophy that he talked about in his book. And he makes a very interesting statement. God may be worshipped and contemplated in any of his aspects, but to persist in worshiping only one aspect to the exclusion of all the rest is to run into grave spiritual peril. Thus, if we approach God with a preconceived idea that he is exclusively the personal, transcendental, all-powerful ruler of the world, we run the risk of becoming entrained in religious rites, proprietary sacrifices, and legalistic observances. He seems to indicate that the more diverse your ideas of God are, if you really try to drill down too far on this and exclude the possibility of everything else, you're missing a spiritual aspect of life that other people have.
I see. Again, relate it back for me, though, to our discussion.
Well, this is always at some point I run across and have to just say, at some point you have to take logic and just put it on the back shelf and not bring it out, because it's possible to overthink things in trying to drill down and find stuff. Because when you look at how people view God, look at the Jewish people. He started out as a warrior god. He then is the God that selected the Jewish people as his personal selected tribe. And then Jesus comes along and says, no, he's actually a personal father that you can personally identify with, which is a far cry from what it started out.
And we can say, therefore, that God has a very long biography spanning many, many centuries. But one could add, as Nietzsche did, but God, like all beings who had a nice long run and went through all sorts of interesting changes in that lifelong story of his, nonetheless, God comes to an end in modern times. He dies. That's what Nietzsche says. He says, and there's a big meaning here, because Nietzsche's proposition is, because he goes on to say in Thus Spake Zarathustra, he's dead because we killed him. We're responsible. This loss of faith is our loss of faith. And the world that we're living in now, the world of 2024, is a different world from the world that used to be in its various manifestations. So God went through all these different changes, and in Jesus' time, we had a much more sophisticated thing. But the message that I'm taking away is, but now that we are where we are, we do finally have to give up on the old man. The old man in the sky isn't there in any form whatsoever. The God of theology is not there in any form whatsoever. It's us. We're here. The world and the things within it, we're here. But we're alone in that sense. There is no further thing. There's no reason to believe that there is. And it's intellectually dishonest, the conclusion goes, to believe otherwise. We only have so much time to live, and there's a way of being honest to the circumstances of our life, and there's a way of being dishonest to the circumstances of our life. And to be honest with the circumstances of our life, we have no reason to believe in the efficacy of prayer, of divine intervention in the form of miracle. Call it what you will. We finally should grow up and admit that we don't have any basis for such ideas, and become human adults, no longer children of the history of the species. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, now I was just thinking that I was alluding to how God evolved for the Jewish people from his inception up until the time of
and
Jesus.
admittedly, the warrior Yahweh does evolve. There are lots of stuff has been written about this, about the evolution of God in that sense. So that's what I meant by talking about his biography. It's an interesting development that we have. We're talking about the development of conceptions of God at the same time. That's what we're talking about, the development of religion itself. Therefore,
And to address your point, look at how it evolved to Jesus. And Jesus got killed for his concept of God. He believed in a personal God that could impact your life through what you did, not through your belief in him, but the fact that there's a part of God in you that you have to pay attention to. And if you do, he uses the term kingdom of God for this realization of what God means in your life as something personal. So from that standpoint, you have to give up on the old man in the sky. We've evolved since then. Have what we evolved with, what Jesus evolved it to, is not inconsistent that what science says the spirituality of God might be like. It gives you a mechanism by which you can hang your hat on. Well, maybe he's not the old man, but what could he be? How could he be important in my life? How could he change my life from the standpoint of, in Jesus's idea, bringing about the kingdom of God? And more importantly, the idea that you have to be born again in a different communion with God than what you thought you had.
Yeah, I think there's a good answer to that. It involves, it's a project for another day, maybe our next conversation. That it has to do with what I call the prophetic view of prophetic Judaism, which is a very, very realistic philosophy that I believe in, and does have plenty of room for the most important elements of what we have called Judaism, and therefore Christianity as well. I have good news as far as that's concerned. I don't say that we can any longer believe in the old man in the sky, but I believe that the main elements of Judeo-Christian aspiration for a world of peace and overcoming the world of violence, and the idea that this is a kind of imperative, a divine imperative inherent in things, I think all that can still be vindicated. So there is a lot there. There are a lot of places to go after we give up the old man in the sky that are still properly religious in a broad sense, if you will.
I think you brought us to a good place to stop. You kind of outlined where we may go with this.
So let's get into that. Let's get into that other stuff sometime soon. Okay.
All right.